The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the early morning silence at exactly 6:15 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 3 years. Detective Marcus Rivera rolled over in his bed, groaning as he reached across to silence the persistent buzzing. Outside his apartment window, the familiar sounds of downtown Phoenix beginning to stir filled the air, distant traffic humming along the interstate, the occasional car door slamming, and the rhythmic footsteps of early morning joggers on the sidewalk below. Marcus had always found comfort in these predictable morning sounds, a steady reminder that the world continued its orderly rotation despite the chaos he witnessed daily in his line of work. Today, however, something felt different. The sound seemed muted, almost hollow, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He dismissed the feeling as nothing more than pre-coffee paranoia and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The radio on his nightstand crackled to life automatically, tuned to the local news station that usually provided traffic updates and weather forecasts. Instead of the cheerful morning DJ's voice, there was an unusual tension in the broadcaster's tone that made Marcus pause mid-stretch. The reporter was discussing some kind of incident at Phoenix General Hospital, something about patients displaying aggressive behavior and several staff members being injured during what officials were calling a containment situation. Marcus frowned, reaching for his phone to check for any emergency notifications from the department. His screen showed 12 missed calls from his partner, Detective Angela Thompson, and a string of urgent text messages that made his blood run cold. Multiple 911 calls coming in citywide, read the most recent message. Something big is happening. Chief wants all available units downtown immediately. This isn't a drill, Marcus. He quickly pulled on yesterday's jeans and grabbed a clean shirt from his closet, his mind racing as he tried to process what kind of emergency could require all available units. In his 15 years with the Phoenix Police Department, he had seen gang wars, drug busts gone wrong, and even a hostage situation that lasted 18 hours, but nothing that had prompted this level of immediate response. As he laced up his boots, the radio continued its increasingly frantic reporting. The hospital incident was apparently spreading beyond the medical facility, with reports of similar aggressive behavior being observed in various locations throughout the downtown area. The reporter's voice cracked slightly as she mentioned that emergency services were being overwhelmed by calls, and residents were being advised to remain indoors until further notice. Marcus grabbed his badge, weapon, and car keys, his training kicking in as he mentally prepared for whatever chaos awaited him outside. The hallway of his apartment building seemed eerily quiet as he made his way to the elevator, passing doors that usually had morning sounds of families preparing for school and work. Instead, he heard only hushed conversations and what sounded like news broadcasts turned up louder than usual. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, he could see through the lobby's glass windows that something was definitely wrong outside. A small crowd had gathered on the opposite street corner, their attention focused on something just out of his line of sight. Their body language suggested fear rather than curiosity. People were backing away, some covering their mouths in apparent shock. Marcus pushed through the lobby doors and immediately noticed the acrid smell of smoke drifting on the morning breeze, mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify but that triggered an instinctive sense of unease. His patrol car was parked just 50 feet away, but as he walked toward it, he could hear screaming coming from the direction where the crowd was gathered. Not the kind of screaming that accompanied typical accidents or arguments, but something more primal, more desperate. He quickened his pace, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his radio. The crowd suddenly scattered in all directions, people running with a panic that suggested they had witnessed something beyond ordinary emergency situations. Marcus broke into a run toward his vehicle, his heart pounding not just from exertion but from a growing realization that whatever was happening in Phoenix this morning was unlike anything he had encountered in his law enforcement career. As he reached his car and fumbled with the keys, a woman ran past him, tears streaming down her face, clutching a small child to her chest. "They're not human anymore," she gasped as she passed, her words barely audible but clear enough to send a chill down Marcus's spine. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the radio immediately crackling to life with dispatch calls that painted a picture of a city descending into chaos, with reports of attacks, unexplained violence, and emergency responders requesting immediate backup across multiple locations throughout Phoenix. Marcus's patrol car roared through the empty streets of downtown Phoenix, the siren wailing against an unsettling backdrop of abandoned vehicles and scattered debris. The radio chattered continuously with increasingly desperate calls from dispatch, painting a picture of a city under siege from an enemy no one seemed to understand. Unit 47, respond to Westfield Shopping Plaza, reports of multiple casualties and suspects displaying extreme violent behavior, crackled through the speaker, followed immediately by another voice cutting in with barely controlled panic. All units, be advised, suspects appear to be unresponsive to verbal commands and standard intervention techniques. Exercise extreme caution. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter as he navigated around an overturned delivery truck, its contents spilled across the intersection like an abstract painting of chaos. The morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings, but instead of the warm, reassuring light he usually associated with Arizona mornings, everything seemed filtered through a lens of impending doom. As he approached the shopping plaza, the first thing that struck him was the silence. No sounds of normal human activity, no car engines, no conversations drifting from the outdoor seating areas of the various restaurants that lined the complex. The parking lot, which should have been filling with early morning shoppers and commuters grabbing coffee, was instead a maze of abandoned vehicles with doors left open, purses and shopping bags scattered on the asphalt as if people had simply vanished mid-stride. Marcus parked his cruiser near the main entrance and stepped out, immediately noticing the metallic smell of blood mixing with the desert air. His training had exposed him to crime scenes before, but this was different. The scent was stronger, fresher, and seemed to permeate everything around him. He unholstered his weapon and approached the shopping center's glass doors, which stood partially open with what appeared to be handprints smeared across the surface in dark, dried stains. Through the entrance, he could see the usually bustling main corridor was dimly lit, with several storefronts showing signs of hasty evacuation, chairs overturned, merchandise scattered, and security gates partially lowered as if the closures had been interrupted mid-process. The echo of his footsteps on the tile floor seemed amplified in the unnatural quiet, and Marcus found himself unconsciously moderating his breathing as he moved deeper into the complex. His radio crackled with his partner Angela's voice checking his location, but he kept his response brief, instinctively knowing that loud sounds might not be wise in this environment. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural moaning sound emanating from somewhere near the food court, accompanied by what sounded like shuffling footsteps and something being dragged across the floor. Marcus moved toward the sound with practiced caution, his weapon raised and his senses hyperalert to any movement in his peripheral vision. As he rounded the corner leading to the food court, he stopped dead in his tracks at a sight that his mind initially refused to process. A figure that had once been a middle-aged man in a business suit was hunched over what appeared to be a security guard, but the figure's movements were all wrong, jerky, unnatural, and accompanied by wet, tearing sounds that made Marcus's stomach lurch. The businessman's shirt was torn and stained with dark patches, and when he raised his head at the sound of Marcus's approach, the detective saw that half of the man's face appeared to have been torn away, revealing bone and tissue underneath. What should have been fatal injuries seemed to have no effect on the figure, who began moving toward Marcus with arms outstretched and that same unsettling moan growing louder. "Phoenix PD, stop right there!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing through the food court, but the figure continued its relentless approach, showing no recognition of the command or even awareness that Marcus had spoken. This was when Marcus noticed movement from behind an overturned table near the pizza restaurant. A tall man with graying temples carefully emerged, followed by a woman in medical scrubs who appeared to be tending to someone's injured arm. The man gestured frantically for Marcus to move away from the approaching figure, mouthing words that Marcus couldn't quite make out but whose urgency was unmistakable. The woman, who Marcus would later learn was Rebecca Walsh, a trauma nurse from Phoenix General, was shaking her head and pointing toward an exit sign while supporting what appeared to be a teenage boy with a bandaged shoulder. The tall man, Jake Morrison, had clearly taken charge of this small group of survivors and was now motioning for Marcus to follow them toward the service corridors that led to the back of the shopping complex. Marcus made a split-second decision that would haunt him for days to come. Instead of attempting to subdue what he still thought might be a human suspect under the influence of drugs or suffering from a mental health crisis, he backed away toward the group of survivors. The figure that had been attacking the security guard continued its mechanical pursuit, joined now by two other figures emerging from the shadows of closed storefronts, all displaying the same disturbing combination of grievous wounds and relentless movement. Jake Morrison grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward the emergency exit, his voice urgent but controlled as he spoke the words that would forever change Marcus's understanding of the world. "Officer, I don't know what these things are, but they're not human anymore, and if they bite you, you become just like them." Rebecca Walsh nodded grimly, adjusting her grip on the injured teenager as they moved toward safety, her medical training evident in how she monitored the boy's condition while navigating the chaos. As they reached the exit, Marcus could hear more of those awful moaning sounds echoing throughout the shopping center, suggesting that whatever had happened here was far more extensive than the initial emergency calls had indicated. The emergency exit alarm shrieked as Jake Morrison pushed through the heavy metal door, leading Marcus, Rebecca, and the injured teenager into the harsh Arizona sunlight behind the shopping complex. The contrast between the dim interior and the blazing morning light momentarily blinded them, but Jake didn't slow his pace as he guided the group across the service road toward a large grocery store that sat adjacent to the plaza. "Supermart has thick walls, multiple exits, and enough supplies to last us weeks if we can secure it properly," Jake explained breathlessly as they half ran, half walked across the asphalt, constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. Rebecca Walsh kept one arm around the teenager, who Marcus now noticed was pale and sweating despite the morning heat, his bandaged shoulder showing concerning dark stains that suggested his wound was more serious than initially apparent. The boy, who introduced himself weakly as Tommy Chen, no relation to anyone Rebecca knew from the hospital, had been working his first shift as a shopping center janitor when the chaos erupted, and his story of hiding in storage rooms while watching co-workers transform into something monstrous provided their first real insight into how quickly the situation had deteriorated. Marcus found himself constantly scanning their surroundings with his law enforcement training, noting details that his civilian companions might miss: abandoned vehicles with their engines still running, suggesting people had fled in extreme haste, scattered personal belongings that indicated panic rather than orderly evacuation, and most concerning, the complete absence of any emergency vehicles or personnel in an area that should have been swarming with first responders. His radio had gone ominously quiet during their escape from the shopping center, and his attempts to raise dispatch or contact his partner Angela were met with only static and occasional fragments of transmissions that were too broken to understand. The grocery store's parking lot showed signs of hasty abandonment similar to the shopping plaza, but Jake seemed to know exactly where he was heading, leading them toward a service entrance near the loading docks where a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. "I used to work security here before I started my construction business," Jake explained as he carefully peered through the opening, checking for any signs of danger before motioning the others to follow. "The layout gives us advantages: thick concrete walls, limited entry points we can barricade, and the storage areas in back can be completely sealed off if necessary." Inside the store, the overhead fluorescent lights hummed with an eerie steadiness that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had just escaped, illuminating aisles of carefully arranged merchandise that seemed like artifacts from a world that no longer existed. Rebecca immediately guided Tommy to the pharmacy section, her nursing instincts taking over as she assessed his deteriorating condition with growing concern. "His wound isn't healing properly, and these fever symptoms aren't consistent with normal infection," she murmured to Marcus as she gathered medical supplies from behind the pharmacy counter, her professional demeanor barely masking her worry. Meanwhile, Jake had begun a systematic survey of the store's security features, checking exit doors, testing the functionality of the electronic locks, and identifying potential weak points in their perimeter. The store's manager's office contained a bank of security monitors that still functioned, providing them with views of the parking lot and main entrances, though several cameras showed only static or disturbing images of figures moving with that same unnatural gait they had witnessed at the shopping center. As Rebecca worked to clean and redress Tommy's wound, she made a discovery that chilled them all to the bone. "These bite marks," she said, pointing to the jagged tears in the teenager's shoulder, "they're not from any animal I've ever treated, and the tissue damage extends far deeper than it should for wounds this size." She paused, her medical training warring with the impossible evidence before her eyes. "More concerning is his elevated temperature, the way his pupils are responding to light, and these neurological symptoms that seem to be progressing rapidly." Tommy himself was becoming increasingly incoherent, mumbling about seeing his co-workers change, and describing symptoms that Rebecca recognized as similar to advanced rabies, but accelerated beyond anything in medical literature. Marcus attempted repeatedly to establish radio contact with his department, trying different frequencies and even attempting to reach neighboring jurisdictions, but each effort yielded only static or fragmentary transmissions that suggested widespread communication failures across the region. Jake's construction experience proved invaluable as he identified building materials within the store that could be used to reinforce their position, heavy shelving units that could be moved to block entrances, industrial plastic sheeting that could create additional barriers, and tools from the hardware section that could be used for both fortification and defense. As they worked to secure their temporary sanctuary, the security monitors began showing increasingly disturbing activity in the parking lot and surrounding area. Figures were shambling between the abandoned vehicles with that characteristic unsteady gait, and their numbers seemed to be growing steadily as more emerged from the shopping complex and surrounding buildings. Rebecca's growing alarm about Tommy's condition reached a critical point when she noticed that his responses to stimuli were becoming increasingly aggressive, and the teenager began showing signs of the same mindless hostility they had witnessed in the figures at the shopping center. The horrible realization that whatever had transformed those people was now working its way through Tommy's system forced them to confront the terrifying possibility that their safe haven might become a trap, and that the enemy they faced could emerge not just from outside their barricades, but from within their own group. 3 days had passed since their arrival at the supermart, and the security monitors painted an increasingly grim picture of the world beyond their barricaded walls. The parking lot now swarmed with dozens of those shambling figures, their numbers growing steadily as more emerged from the surrounding neighborhood, drawn by sounds and movement that seemed to trigger some primitive hunting instinct. Tommy's condition had deteriorated rapidly despite Rebecca's round-the-clock medical care, and the teenager now spent most of his time restrained in the manager's office, his lucid moments becoming increasingly rare and violent. Marcus had taken the night watch, observing through the security cameras as the creatures outside displayed a disturbing level of persistence, repeatedly testing their barricades and showing no signs of losing interest or wandering away. During Tommy's brief periods of clarity, he had provided crucial information about how quickly the transformation occurred and how the infected seemed to retain some basic motor functions while losing all higher reasoning, but these revelations came at the cost of watching a young man slowly lose his humanity before their eyes. Jake's construction expertise had helped them reinforce their position effectively, but their food and water supplies were diminishing faster than anticipated, complicated by the fact that much of the store's perishable inventory had spoiled without proper refrigeration after the power grid's partial failure. Rebecca's medical supplies were also running critically low, particularly antibiotics and pain medication that she had been using to keep Tommy comfortable during his transformation, and her nursing experience told her that they would need pharmaceutical-grade supplies if any of them suffered injuries during what seemed like an inevitable confrontation with the creatures outside. Marcus's attempts to establish communication had finally yielded results on the fourth morning, when he managed to pick up a weak military transmission on an emergency frequency that spoke of evacuation zones being established along the California coast and inland safe areas where survivors were being gathered for protection and eventual transport. The transmission also contained disturbing intelligence about major population centers experiencing complete communication breakdowns and unconfirmed reports of similar outbreaks occurring simultaneously across multiple states, suggesting that whatever had caused the crisis in Phoenix was far more widespread than they had initially feared. The decision to venture outside for supplies came when Rebecca's examination revealed that Tommy had less than 12 hours before his transformation would be complete, and their remaining food would last perhaps 2 more days if they continued rationing strictly. Jake identified a pharmacy approximately 6 blocks away that would likely contain the medical supplies Rebecca needed, as well as a sporting goods store that could provide them with better defensive equipment than the improvised weapons they had fashioned from store inventory. Marcus's police training made him the logical choice to lead the expedition, but Jake's knowledge of the local area and Rebecca's medical expertise meant that all three would need to leave their sanctuary, taking Tommy with them since leaving him behind posed too great a risk should his restraints fail. They spent hours planning their route using street maps from the store's office, identifying alternative paths and potential shelter points while studying the security monitors to understand the movement patterns of the creatures that now dominated their neighborhood. Their first encounter with other survivors came unexpectedly as they prepared to leave through the loading dock entrance, when a group of 5 armed individuals approached their barricades under a makeshift white flag fashioned from a torn bedsheet. The group's leader, a heavy-set man named Frank Garrison who claimed to be a former security supervisor, initially seemed friendly and reasonable as he explained that his people had been surviving in a fortified apartment complex several miles away. However, Jake's wariness proved justified when Frank's true intentions became clear. His group had been systematically raiding other survivor enclaves, taking supplies by force and abandoning anyone who couldn't contribute to their collective defense. When Marcus refused Frank's offer to join their operation in exchange for protection, the conversation quickly turned hostile, with Frank's companions raising their weapons and demanding access to the supermart's supplies. The standoff was resolved only when the noise of their confrontation attracted a swarm of creatures from the shopping center, forcing both groups to retreat to avoid being overrun, but not before Frank made it clear that he considered the supermart's resources fair game and would return with more people and better weapons. The encounter with Frank's group added a new dimension to their survival challenges, as they now faced threats from both the infected creatures and other humans who had abandoned moral constraints in favor of brutal pragmatism. Rebecca's growing desperation about Tommy's condition forced them to accelerate their timeline, and they made the difficult decision to attempt their supply run immediately rather than wait for a more favorable situation. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, the security monitors showed that Frank's group had taken positions in buildings across the street, apparently waiting for them to emerge so they could follow and potentially ambush them when they returned with whatever supplies they managed to gather. The military transmission had provided coordinates for the nearest evacuation zone, located at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base southeast of Tucson, but reaching it would require traveling over 100 miles through territory that was now completely unknown in terms of safety and accessibility. Marcus checked his service weapon one final time as they prepared to venture into a world that had become infinitely more dangerous than any of them had imagined possible just a week earlier, knowing that their survival now depended not just on avoiding the infected, but on outmaneuvering other humans who had chosen to prey upon the desperate rather than work together against their common enemy. The early morning air carried an acrid smell of smoke and decay as Marcus, Jake, Rebecca, and Tommy emerged from the supermart's loading dock into a world that bore little resemblance to the Phoenix they had known just a week earlier. Tommy's condition had stabilized temporarily with the last of Rebecca's medication, giving them a narrow window of opportunity to move him while he remained somewhat coherent, though his eyes held a glazed quality that suggested his time was running short. Jake had fashioned a makeshift stretcher from shopping carts and canvas tarps, allowing them to transport Tommy while keeping their hands free for weapons, and Marcus had plotted a route that would take them through residential neighborhoods rather than the main commercial areas where Frank's group was likely to be watching. The streets they traversed told a story of rapid societal collapse, abandoned vehicles clustered at intersections where traffic lights continued their meaningless cycle, houses with front doors standing open and windows broken from the inside out, and everywhere the signs of people who had fled with only what they could carry in their desperate rush to escape an enemy they didn't understand. Their destination was a military checkpoint that Marcus had heard referenced in the fragmented radio transmissions, located at the intersection of two major highways approximately 8 miles southeast of their position. The journey required them to navigate through several residential subdivisions where the silence was broken only by their own footsteps and the occasional distant moan that suggested they were not alone in these seemingly empty neighborhoods. Rebecca walked beside Tommy's improvised stretcher, monitoring his vital signs and administering small doses of their remaining medication to keep him stable, while Jake used his construction experience to identify potential shelter points and escape routes in case they encountered either the infected or hostile survivors. Marcus took point, his police training allowing him to read the subtle signs of danger in their environment, doors that had been forced open from the outside, bloodstains that told stories of violence and struggle, and the eerie absence of normal urban sounds that should have accompanied a city of Phoenix's size. The first sign that something was wrong at the checkpoint came when they were still over a mile away and could see smoke rising from what should have been a secure military position. As they drew closer, the scope of the disaster became increasingly apparent through binoculars that Jake had salvaged from the sporting goods section of the supermart. The checkpoint, which should have been a beacon of safety and organization, was instead a scene of utter devastation with overturned military vehicles, scattered equipment, and no signs of organized human presence. Bodies in military fatigues lay motionless around defensive positions that had clearly been overrun, and the creatures that now wandered through the area included some wearing the remnants of military gear, suggesting that even trained soldiers had been unable to contain whatever had swept through the installation. The sight crushed their hopes of finding official rescue and forced them to confront the reality that government resources had been overwhelmed just as completely as civilian infrastructure. Tommy's condition took a sharp turn for the worse as they observed the destroyed checkpoint, his fever spiking and his periods of violent agitation becoming more frequent despite Rebecca's medical interventions. The sound of his increasingly loud moans began attracting attention from creatures in the surrounding area, forcing them to seek immediate shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned elementary school whose playground equipment stood like monuments to a world that children would never again experience safely. Jake used bolt cutters from his tool collection to breach the chain-link fence surrounding the school, and they quickly moved Tommy into the building through a side entrance that had been left unlocked by whoever had evacuated the facility. The school's interior showed signs of hasty abandonment with children's artwork still hanging on bulletin boards, desks arranged for lessons that would never be completed, and personal belongings scattered in hallways where teachers and students had fled when the crisis reached their community. In the school's nurse's office, they encountered their first new survivors in days when a voice called out from behind a barricaded door, asking them to identify themselves and explain their intentions. The voice belonged to Lisa Rodriguez, a third-grade teacher who had been at the school when the evacuation order came and had remained behind to help coordinate the departure of children whose parents couldn't be reached immediately. With Lisa were two other survivors, David Park, the school's maintenance supervisor who had used his knowledge of the building's layout to create secure hiding places, and Maria Santos, a parent volunteer who had been in the building when chaos erupted and had chosen to stay and help rather than risk traveling alone with her young daughter Emma. Lisa's group had been surviving in the school for 6 days, using the cafeteria's emergency food supplies and the building's multiple exits to avoid detection by the creatures that periodically wandered through the surrounding neighborhood. The reunion provided both hope and new challenges, as Lisa's group had managed to establish contact with other survivor enclaves around the city using a ham radio that David had assembled from electronics salvaged from the school's computer lab. Their intelligence painted a sobering picture of Phoenix as a city where organized resistance had completely collapsed, with scattered groups of survivors holding out in fortified positions while waiting for rescue that might never come. Tommy's transformation accelerated rapidly in the school environment, forcing Rebecca to make the heartbreaking decision to sedate him heavily to prevent him from endangering the other survivors, while Lisa shared her own tragic story of watching colleagues and students succumb to the infection during the chaotic evacuation. As they settled into what they hoped would be a more secure sanctuary, the reality of their situation became clear. They were no longer waiting for rescue, but would need to find their own way to safety in a world where traditional authority had ceased to exist and survival depended entirely on their ability to work together against impossible odds. The false sense of security that the elementary school provided lasted exactly 18 hours before everything unraveled in a cascade of betrayal and terror that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their ordeal. Tommy's condition had stabilized under Rebecca's careful sedation, though his periodic moments of consciousness revealed a personality that was increasingly hostile and disconnected from the gentle teenager they had known. Lisa Rodriguez had proven invaluable in organizing their expanded group, using her teaching experience to establish schedules for watch duty, food rationing, and defensive preparations, while David Park's maintenance knowledge helped them understand the building's structural advantages and potential escape routes. Maria Santos had initially seemed like a blessing, bringing valuable information about safe houses and supply caches that her late husband, a former police officer, had established throughout the city before succumbing to the infection during the early days of the outbreak. The betrayal came from an unexpected source when Maria revealed her true motivations during what should have been a routine planning session for their next supply run. Her husband had indeed been a police officer, but he had also been involved with Frank Garrison's group before the outbreak, and Maria had been feeding information about survivor locations to Frank's raiders in exchange for protection for herself and her daughter Emma. The revelation came when David discovered Maria using the ham radio to transmit their location and group composition to coordinates that didn't match any of the known survivor enclaves they had been monitoring. When confronted, Maria's desperation became apparent as she explained that Frank's group had her older son Kevin hostage and would kill him if she didn't provide intelligence about well-supplied survivor groups that could be targeted for raids. Her anguish was genuine, but the damage was already done. Frank's people now knew their exact location, their defensive capabilities, and their supply status. Marcus felt the familiar weight of betrayal that he had experienced during his police career, but in this new world, the consequences were measured not in legal proceedings but in immediate life-or-death situations. Jake's anger was more direct and practical, focusing on how Maria's deception had compromised their carefully planned security measures and put everyone at risk, particularly young Emma, who would now suffer for her mother's impossible choices. Rebecca's medical perspective made her somewhat more sympathetic to Maria's position, understanding the desperate calculus that parents faced when trying to protect their children in a world where traditional moral frameworks had collapsed along with everything else. Lisa struggled with the educational instincts that made her want to find teachable moments and reasonable solutions, even as the reality of their situation demanded harsh decisions about trust and survival that no classroom experience had prepared her for. The immediate crisis came not from Frank's group, but from Tommy, whose sedation wore off just as the argument about Maria's betrayal reached its peak. The teenager's moaning attracted attention from creatures that had been wandering through the neighborhood, and their increasingly aggressive attempts to reach the source of the sound began testing the school's barricades in ways that David's defensive preparations hadn't anticipated. Rebecca made the difficult decision to increase Tommy's sedation to dangerous levels, knowing that keeping him quiet was essential for the group's survival, but also understanding that she was essentially hastening his death to protect the others. The sound of breaking glass from the main entrance indicated that their defenses had been breached, and Jake's quick thinking led them toward the basement access tunnels that David had identified as potential escape routes during his maintenance work. The school's basement revealed an unexpected asset in the form of utility tunnels that connected to the municipal storm drain system, providing underground access to several different neighborhoods without exposure to the creatures that now filled the hallways above them. David's knowledge of the building's infrastructure proved crucial as he guided them through a maze of pipes, electrical conduits, and maintenance spaces that would have been impassable without his expertise. The tunnels were cramped, dark, and filled with the echoing sounds of water dripping and distant rumbling that suggested ongoing structural damage throughout the city's underground systems. Rebecca was forced to carry Tommy in a makeshift sling that allowed her to monitor his vital signs while navigating the difficult terrain, though his condition continued to deteriorate rapidly despite her efforts. The group's separation occurred when they reached a junction in the tunnel system where structural damage had partially collapsed one of the main passages, forcing them to split into two groups to continue their escape. Marcus, Rebecca, and Tommy took the eastern route that David indicated would lead toward the medical district, where Rebecca hoped to find hospital-grade supplies that might help Tommy or at least make his final hours more comfortable. Jake, Lisa, Maria, Emma, and David chose the western passage that should emerge near a residential area where Lisa had heard reports of a well-organized survivor community. The parting was rushed and emotional, with promises to reunite at predetermined coordinates and radio frequencies, but everyone understood that they might never see each other again. As the two groups disappeared into separate tunnels, the sounds of creatures breaking through the school's defenses echoed through the underground passages, serving as a grim reminder that nowhere was truly safe and that survival depended on constantly moving forward into an uncertain future where each decision could mean the difference between life and death. The eastern tunnel system led Marcus, Rebecca, and Tommy through a nightmarish underground journey that lasted nearly 14 hours, with only David's hastily sketched map and Marcus's police knowledge of the city's layout to guide them through passages that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath Phoenix. Tommy's condition had reached a critical point where Rebecca could no longer safely sedate him without risking immediate death, forcing them to endure his increasingly violent episodes while trying to muffle the sounds that might attract creatures through the storm drains above them. The tunnels themselves told a story of urban decay that predated the current crisis, with evidence of homeless encampments and maintenance neglect that suggested the city's infrastructure had been failing long before the outbreak brought civilization to its knees. Marcus found himself thinking about his partner Angela, wondering if she had survived the initial chaos and whether any of his colleagues from the Phoenix Police Department were still alive somewhere in this transformed world. Rebecca's nursing instincts drove her to continue treating Tommy even as his humanity slipped away, a decision that Marcus initially questioned but came to understand as necessary for her own psychological survival as much as any hope for Tommy's recovery. They emerged from the tunnel system near Phoenix General Hospital, the same facility where the first reports of aggressive patient behavior had originated nearly a week earlier, and the sight that greeted them confirmed their worst fears about the medical community's fate. The hospital's windows were shattered, emergency vehicles sat abandoned in the parking lot with their doors torn off, and the building itself showed signs of fires that had burned unchecked before extinguishing themselves. Bodies and medical scrubs were scattered around the entrance, and creatures wearing the remnants of hospital uniforms wandered aimlessly through the parking areas, their presence making any approach to the building's medical supplies impossible. It was Rebecca who spotted the radio tower rising from the hospital's roof, its red aviation lights still blinking steadily despite the chaos below, suggesting that emergency power systems might still be functioning in parts of the building. Marcus's police training included basic knowledge of radio equipment, and he recognized that the tower's continued operation meant someone might still be broadcasting or monitoring emergency frequencies from within the hospital's upper floors. The challenge was reaching the tower without alerting the creatures that filled the lower levels of the building, a task that required them to find an alternative entrance through the hospital's maintenance systems or emergency stairwells. Tommy's condition forced them to make the heartbreaking decision to secure him in a loading dock storage room with enough sedation to keep him unconscious for several hours, knowing that they might not return before the medication wore off and he completed his transformation. Their infiltration of the hospital led them through emergency stairwells filled with debris and abandoned medical equipment, past floors where emergency lighting revealed scenes of desperate struggles and hasty evacuations. The radio equipment was located in the hospital's emergency management center on the 8th floor, where they discovered that automated systems had been broadcasting a loop of evacuation instructions and emergency information for the past 4 days. More importantly, they found a functioning ham radio setup that allowed them to monitor communications from survivor groups across the region and beyond, revealing the true scope of the crisis that had engulfed not just Phoenix, but major population centers throughout the American Southwest. The transmissions painted a picture of coordinated attacks that had occurred simultaneously across multiple states, with reports coming in from Las Vegas, Albuquerque, Denver, and Salt Lake City describing identical outbreaks that had overwhelmed emergency services and government response capabilities. Among the static and fragmented emergency broadcasts, they picked up a clear military transmission that provided the first concrete hope they had encountered since leaving the supermart. The broadcast identified evacuation points along the California coast where U.S. Navy vessels were loading survivors for transport to secure facilities on offshore islands that had been cleared of infected populations. The nearest evacuation point was located at Camp Pendleton, approximately 350 miles west of Phoenix, with the broadcast indicating that evacuation operations would continue for 72 more hours before the naval vessels departed for permanent offshore installations. The transmission also provided detailed route information and checkpoint locations where survivors could receive supplies and medical attention during their journey to the coast, though the broadcast emphasized that overland travel was extremely dangerous and that survival could not be guaranteed. Their reunion with Jake's group occurred through the radio itself, when Lisa Rodriguez's voice crackled through the static during their second hour of monitoring emergency frequencies. Jake's group had discovered their own radio setup in a residential area where a ham radio enthusiast had established a neighborhood communication network before succumbing to the infection, and David Park's technical skills had enabled them to boost their signal strength and establish contact with multiple survivor groups throughout the region. Lisa's report was both encouraging and sobering. Their group had successfully evaded Frank Garrison's raiders and had connected with a well-organized survivor community, but they had also learned that the infection was continuing to spread and that creature populations were growing larger and more aggressive as they consumed the remaining human populations in urban areas. The emotional reunion over the radio waves was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the hospital's lower floors, indicating that their presence had been detected by the creatures below. Marcus made the decision to abandon their elevated position and attempt to reunite with Jake's group at coordinates they established during their radio contact, even though it meant leaving behind the communication equipment that had provided them with crucial intelligence about the evacuation operations. Rebecca's final check on Tommy revealed that his transformation was nearly complete, and she made the painful choice to end his suffering with a lethal injection rather than allow him to become another threat to any survivors he might encounter. As they prepared to leave the hospital through the same maintenance route they had used to enter, the radio crackled one final time with a transmission that would drive their desperate race to the coast. The military broadcast announced that departure schedules had been accelerated due to increasing creature activity along the evacuation routes, giving them less than 60 hours to travel 350 miles through territory that was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. The reunion of both groups occurred at an abandoned gas station 15 miles southwest of Phoenix, where Jake had established a temporary base using his construction expertise to fortify the building against both creature attacks and potential raids from Frank Garrison's group. The emotional relief of seeing familiar faces was tempered by the absence of Tommy, whose loss Rebecca explained with the clinical detachment that medical professionals develop to cope with impossible decisions, though Marcus could see the profound grief behind her professional demeanor. David Park had proven invaluable to Jake's group by establishing communication networks with other survivor enclaves, revealing that their small band was part of a larger exodus of desperate people attempting to reach the coastal evacuation points before the naval vessels departed forever. Maria Santos had redeemed herself somewhat by providing crucial intelligence about Frank's movements and helping to establish contact with her surviving son Kevin, who had escaped from the raiders and was attempting to reach the coast through a different route. The journey to Camp Pendleton required them to travel through terrain that had become increasingly hostile as creature populations concentrated along major transportation routes, drawn by the movement of vehicles and the sounds of other survivor groups attempting the same desperate migration. Jake's leadership experience had proven essential in organizing their convoy using 3 vehicles salvaged from the gas station and surrounding area, a pickup truck that could carry their supplies and provide elevated shooting positions, a sedan that offered speed and maneuverability, and a maintenance van that David had modified with reinforced panels and multiple escape hatches. Rebecca had used the gas station's first aid supplies to create a mobile medical kit that could treat injuries during their journey, while Lisa applied her organizational skills to coordinate food rationing and rest schedules that would keep everyone functional during the estimated 18-hour drive to the coast. Their first major obstacle came 30 miles outside Phoenix when they encountered a massive traffic jam of abandoned vehicles that stretched for nearly 5 miles along Interstate 10, creating a maze of twisted metal and debris that harbored thousands of creatures who had been feeding on trapped motorists for over a week. Marcus's police experience proved crucial as he identified alternative routes using service roads and farm access paths that could bypass the main highway, though these detours added precious hours to their journey and forced them to navigate through rural areas where radio contact with other survivor groups was impossible. The sight of the traffic jam served as a sobering reminder of how quickly civilization had collapsed, with evidence that people had attempted to evacuate in organized fashion before being overwhelmed by the sheer speed and scale of the outbreak. David Park's mechanical skills became essential when their pickup truck suffered engine problems during their detour through agricultural areas, forcing them to stop in an exposed position while he attempted repairs using tools and parts salvaged from abandoned farm equipment. The delay occurred at the worst possible time, as radio transmissions indicated that creature populations were moving west along the same routes being used by survivor groups, creating massive herds that threatened to overrun anyone caught in the open. Rebecca worked with Lisa to establish a defensive perimeter around their stopped convoy, using their limited ammunition strategically while Jake scouted for alternative vehicles in nearby farm buildings, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining mobility in the face of overwhelming numbers. The largest zombie horde they had encountered appeared on the horizon just as David completed his emergency repairs, a moving wall of thousands of creatures that stretched across the landscape like a dark tide flowing toward the coast. Maria Santos made the first heroic sacrifice when she volunteered to drive the damaged pickup truck in the opposite direction, using its horn and engine noise to draw the horde away from the main group and buying them precious time to escape in the remaining vehicles. Her final radio transmission to her daughter Emma was a message of love and hope, telling the little girl to remember that her mother had chosen to fight so that others could live to see a better world. David Park's sacrifice came 20 miles later when their van became trapped in a narrow canyon pass and he chose to remain behind with improvised explosives, bringing down a rockslide that blocked the pass and prevented pursuing creatures from following the survivors but sealing his own fate in the process. Jake Morrison's final act of leadership occurred within sight of Camp Pendleton's evacuation zone, where naval vessels were already departing ahead of schedule due to the approaching creature hordes that threatened to overwhelm the coastal defenses. When their remaining vehicles suffered a catastrophic breakdown less than 2 miles from safety, Jake insisted on staying behind to provide covering fire while Marcus, Rebecca, Lisa, and Emma made the final sprint to the evacuation point on foot. His construction experience had taught him to build things that would last, and his final defensive position held long enough for the others to reach the naval perimeter, where military personnel rushed them aboard the last transport helicopter as creature masses began overrunning the evacuation zone. As their helicopter lifted off toward the waiting ships, Rebecca held Emma close while Marcus and Lisa watched the California coastline disappear behind them, carrying with them the memories of those who had sacrificed everything to ensure that humanity would survive to rebuild in whatever new world awaited them beyond the horizon.